"Watch this," my mother said, holding a steaming cup of coffee over my lap at a crowded Chicago country club brunch. That is how we treat trash. My brother and sister recorded the whole thing, laughing hysterically as the video went live. They thought they were putting the family failure in her place. What they did not know was that just 48 hours prior, I became the ruthless CEO of the holding company that owned their entire lives, and I was about to take everything they had. My name is Diana, and I am 34 years old. For the past 16 years, I have been the ultimate scapegoat of my family. Cut off and discarded at 18, with nothing but the clothes on my back, I had to learn how to survive the hard way. They threw me out because I refused to be a pawn in their endless games of social climbing and corporate manipulation. Today, I am the CEO of Apex Holdings, a massive corporate restructuring firm known for acquiring failing businesses and stripping them down to the studs. I built my empire in absolute silence, far away from the toxic country club elitism my family worshipped. I maintained zero contact with them until my mother Barbara suddenly demanded I meet them for brunch. She claimed it was time to bury the hatchet and reconnect as a family. I knew better. My mother never did anything without a malicious ulterior motive. But I accepted the invitation anyway because I had a massive secret of my own. My company had just executed a hostile takeover of Vanguard Logistics. That was the exact company where my father Richard treated the operations department like his personal piggy bank. It was the company where my golden boy brother Jason played the role of regional director, despite having zero actual business acumen. And it was the company where my spoiled younger sister Amanda collected a massive six-figure salary for a ghost job doing absolutely nothing. The Oak Brook Country Club was exactly as I remembered it from my miserable childhood. It had crystal chandeliers, vaulted ceilings, and an atmosphere thick with old money and unearned arrogance. I arrived wearing simple, unbranded clothing. It was a deliberate strategic choice. I wore a tailored black turtleneck and dark trousers that gave absolutely no indication of my actual wealth or status. I walked across the dining room to the table overlooking the pristine golf course. My family was already seated and waiting. Richard was nursing a mimosa, looking as arrogant and dismissive as ever. Barbara wore a designer dress that screamed for attention and validation from the surrounding tables. Jason sat there tapping aggressively on his latest smartphone, while Amanda adjusted her heavy diamond bracelets with a practiced air of superiority. When I sat down, no one offered a hug, a handshake, or even a genuine smile. "So you actually showed up today?" Jason sneered, not bothering to look up from his bright, glowing screen. "I see you are still shopping at those cheap little discount stores. Have you finally run out of your money and decided to come crawling back?" I placed my white linen napkin on my lap, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "You invited me, Barbara," I said, addressing my mother directly. "You said we needed to talk about the family and clear the air." Barbara swirled the coffee in her delicate porcelain cup. A wicked, condescending smirk crawled across her perfectly made-up face. "We did need to talk, Diana," she said, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "We needed to remind you of exactly where you stand in this family hierarchy. You have been an embarrassment to the Vanguard name since the day you were born. We invited you here to make sure you remember that you are nothing to us. You do not belong in our world." Before I could fully process the sheer, calculated cruelty of her words, Barbara abruptly stood up from her chair. She picked up the freshly poured steaming carafe of coffee from the center of the table. "Watch this," she said loudly enough for the neighboring tables to stop their conversations and turn to look. "That is how we treat trash." Without a single second of hesitation, she tipped the heavy carafe and poured the scalding dark liquid directly into my lap. The intense heat seared through my trousers instantly. A shocking wave of pain radiated across my skin, burning my thighs, but I absolutely refused to flinch. I gripped the edge of my chair with white knuckles, forcing my breathing to remain slow and steady. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear or a cry of pain. Laughter erupted immediately around the table. It was not polite chuckling, but harsh, hysterical laughter from my own flesh and blood. I looked up to see Jason and Amanda holding their phones high, recording every second of my public humiliation. "Look at her!" Amanda shrieked through her cruel laughter. "The little street rat does not even know what to do. Maybe we should throw her a few quarters so she can buy some new pants at the thrift store." Jason zoomed in with his camera lens, his face twisted in an ugly, mocking sneer. "Say cheese for the internet, Diana," he taunted, waving the phone in my face. "Let everyone see what happens when the family failure tries to sit at the big adult table. You are going to be famous for all the wrong reasons." I shifted my gaze to my father. Richard simply sat back in his plush leather chair, crossing one leg over the other and taking a slow, deliberate sip of his mimosa. He watched his wife physically assault his daughter and watched his children record the evidence like it was the most mundane morning entertainment in the world. He was completely unfazed, a silent conductor orchestrating my destruction. They all assumed I was still the broke, terrified teenager they threw away 16 years ago. They assumed I would break down, cry, beg for mercy, and run away in shame. They assumed completely wrong. I slowly stood up from the table. The dark coffee dripped from my soaked trousers onto the expensive Persian rug below, pooling around my shoes. The hot liquid continued to burn against my legs, but my mind was completely cold and analytical. I picked up a crisp white linen napkin and deliberately wiped my hands clean of the splattered coffee. I reached into my small, unbranded leather purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I placed it gently on the center of the table right next to the empty carafe. For the waiter, I said, my voice dangerously calm and terrifyingly even. "He is going to need a generous tip to clean up the disgusting mess you just made." I did not yell. I did not scream or cause a further scene. I turned my head and looked dead into the lens of Jason's camera. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was a look of absolute knowing certainty that promised utter devastation. Without another word, I turned my back on the people who shared my blood and walked out of the dining room. My stride was perfectly measured and entirely confident. I kept my head high, ignoring the shocked stares and open mouths of the other wealthy patrons who had witnessed the entire spectacle unfold. Outside, the crisp Chicago air hit my face, bringing a welcome relief to the burning sensation on my legs. My private driver stepped out of the idling black town car and quickly opened the rear door for me, looking concerned at the stains on my clothes. I waved off his concern and slid into the luxurious leather seat, savoring the quiet, secure privacy of the cabin. As the car pulled away from the country club gates, my phone buzzed violently with an alert. I opened the notification on my screen. It took less than 5 minutes for Jason to post the video online. He had uploaded it to every major social media platform with a cruel, targeted caption, "Putting the family failure in her place." The video was already gaining rapid traction, the likes and shares multiplying by the second as the comments came flooding in. I did not report the video to the platforms. I did not text him to take it down or threaten legal action for the assault. I wanted that video to stay exactly where it was. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, highly confidential dossier. The heavy cardstock cover was stamped with bold black letters. Vanguard Logistics, Executive Restructuring and Terminations. I opened the file to the very first page detailing the executive compensation packages. I took a red pen from my own inside jacket pocket. Methodically and deliberately, I circled my father's name, then my brother's name, then my sister's name. The bright red ink bled into the paper like a blood promise. They thought they had ruined my day and solidified their superiority. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the perfect ammunition to ruin their entire lives. Tomorrow morning, they would walk into the corporate headquarters expecting to rule the world as they always had. But they would find me waiting in the boardroom, ready to strip away every dollar, every title, and every ounce of dignity they possessed. The corporate slaughter was fully prepared, and I was holding the executioner's sharp blade. Monday morning hit Chicago with a bitter chill, but the real frost was waiting on the 42nd floor of the Vanguard Logistics Tower. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany boardroom table, perfectly still, watching the digital clock on the wall tick down to exactly 9 in the morning. My transition from the discarded scapegoat to the ultimate authority was complete. I had explicitly ordered building security to clear the entire executive floor. There were no assistants typing away at their desks. There were no middle managers milling around the espresso machines. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system and the steady breathing of the 4 people flanking my sides. To my left sat my chief corporate counsel and a senior employment attorney. To my right sat 2 forensic accountants from Apex Holdings. We were a firing squad dressed in bespoke suits waiting for the condemned to walk through the glass double doors. Down in the lobby, my family was likely trying to maintain their usual arrogant swagger. I had watched the security camera feeds as Richard pulled his luxury car into the VIP parking spot he had commanded for a decade. Barbara stepped out wearing a bright yellow dress and oversized sunglasses, looking like she was heading to a charity luncheon rather than a corporate execution. Jason and Amanda followed closely behind them, clutching their designer bags and expensive coffees. They were clearly operating under the delusion that this was going to be a private, emotional family meeting. They thought they could walk into Richard's spacious corner office, close the blinds, shed a few fake tears, and manipulate me into dropping the issue. They genuinely believed that blood ties would grant them immunity from the corporate reckoning they had triggered. When the elevator doors chimed and opened onto the executive floor, the reality of their situation immediately hit them. 2 armed corporate security guards stood rigidly in front of the boardroom entrance. The usual bustling energy of the office was entirely absent. I watched through the glass walls as Richard's confident stride faltered. He looked around the empty desks, confusion wrinkling his forehead. Jason nervously adjusted his tie, his bravado slipping away as one of the guards stepped forward and instructed them to enter the boardroom. Barbara tried to offer the guard a condescending smile, but he remained completely stoic, opening the heavy wooden doors and gesturing for them to step inside. The trap had been set, the bait was taken, and the doors firmly closed behind them. The moment they stepped into the room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I remained seated at the head of the table, my hands folded neatly over a pristine black folder. I did not stand to greet them. I did not offer a polite nod. I simply let them take in the terrifying optics of the situation. My legal and financial team stared at them with absolute unblinking professionalism. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from the attorneys to the accountants and finally to me. The color drained from his face as he realized this was not a family mediation. This was a tribunal. "Take a seat, Vice President Thorne," I said, my voice carrying the sharp, authoritative edge of a chief executive officer. I gestured to the 4 empty chairs positioned on the opposite side of the long table. "Regional Director Thorne, Vice President of Communications, please sit down. Barbara. As you are not an employee of Vanguard Logistics, you may sit in the gallery chair against the wall." My mother gasped, placing a hand over her chest in an exaggerated display of shock. She was entirely unaccustomed to being sidelined or treated as a mere spectator. "Diana," she started, taking a step toward me. I said, "Sit down, Barbara." I did not raise my voice, but the absolute coldness in my tone stopped her in her tracks. She looked at Richard for backup, but my father was already lowering himself into a chair, his eyes fixed on the corporate attorneys sitting beside me. Jason and Amanda quickly followed his lead, pulling out their chairs with trembling hands. They looked like terrified children called to the principal's office, stripped of the country club armor they usually wore so proudly. "Let us make one thing perfectly clear before we begin," I stated, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "In this building and in this boardroom, I am not your daughter. I am not your sister. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings, the parent company that fully acquired Vanguard Logistics last Friday at 4 in the afternoon. You will address me as Diana, or you will address me as your Chief Executive. There will be no familial titles used in this meeting. Do you understand?" Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight against his stiff collar. "Yes," he muttered the word, barely escaping his lips. Barbara could not handle the shift in the power dynamic. She had spent her entire life controlling every room she walked into, using her status as a mother to manipulate and demean me. She pushed away from the wall and stepped up to the table, forcing a wide, artificial smile that made her look completely desperate. "Diana, sweetheart," she began, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickening sweetness she used when she wanted something. "This is entirely unnecessary. I know you are upset about yesterday. But it was just a silly family joke. You know how your brother gets when he has had a few drinks at brunch. We all got a little carried away. We came here today to apologize and take you out to a nice lunch to make up for it. We are family, Diana. You cannot possibly take a tiny little spilled cup of coffee this seriously. I slowly opened a thin gray folder resting on the table. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the polished mahogany surface toward Jason. This is a printed copy of the Vanguard Logistics Employee Code of Conduct, I said, ignoring Barbara entirely. Specifically, it highlights the section regarding off-duty conduct, public brand representation, and targeted harassment. Regional Director Thorne, yesterday you uploaded a video of a physical assault to multiple global social media platforms. You publicly identified yourselves as representatives of this family, and by extension, this company. Jason's face turned a sickly shade of pale. It was a personal account. He stammered, his voice cracking slightly. I did not mention the company. It has nothing to do with my job. The primary employment attorney to my left leaned forward. The video currently has 12 million views across 3 platforms, he stated clinically. Within the last 48 hours, major financial news outlets have successfully identified the victim of that assault as the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, the new parent company of Vanguard Logistics. By publicly humiliating the head of this organization, you have created a massive unmitigated liability for our corporate brand. You have breached the morality clause in your executive contract, and you have exposed this company to significant public relations damage. Amanda crossed her arms over her chest, her spoiled nature overriding her common sense. This is so unfair, she whined, glaring at me. You are just doing this because you are still mad that we kicked you out when you were 18. You are using your new job to get back at us because you have always been jealous of me and Jason. You are just being vindictive. I turned my gaze to my younger sister, letting the heavy silence stretch out until she began to squirm in her seat. Amanda, I said softly, I am not jealous of a woman who has to rely on her father to pay her credit card bills because she possesses absolutely zero marketable skills. My decision today has absolutely nothing to do with jealousy or vindictiveness. It has to do with liability compliance and corporate hygiene. Richard had finally heard enough. The patriarchal dominance he had wielded over our family for 3 decades suddenly flared up, overriding his corporate survival instincts. He slammed his fist down on the boardroom table, the loud crack echoing through the large room. Enough of this nonsense! Richard bellowed, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. He stood up from his chair, towering over the table, in an attempt to physically intimidate me. I do not care what title you bought for yourself, Diana. I am your father, and you will show me some damn respect. I built this operations department from the ground up. I put food on your table for 18 years. You are not going to sit here with your fancy lawyers and threaten my job or my son's job over a spilled cup of coffee. You will close that file, dismiss these attorneys, and we will handle this at home like a real family. I did not shrink back. I did not break eye contact. I calmly reached out and placed my hand on the thick black dossier resting in the center of my desk. I slid the heavy folder across the smooth wooden table. It came to a stop exactly 1 inch from Richard's clenched fist. I looked up at him, my expression devoid of any mercy. I am not here to fire you over a cup of coffee, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. I am here to fire you for what is in this folder. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolutely deafening. Richard stared at the thick black folder resting just 1 inch from his clenched fist. The arrogant fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden creeping shadow of doubt. He pulled his hand back slowly, treating the cardboard file as if it were a live explosive device. Next to him, Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smug confidence my brother had worn like a second skin for his entire life was beginning to melt away under the harsh fluorescent lights of the executive suite. Amanda just looked confused, her gaze darting between my face and the folder, completely oblivious to the corporate execution that was about to take place. I did not break eye contact with my father. For 16 years, I had waited for this exact moment. I had spent countless sleepless nights building my firm, analyzing spreadsheets, and mastering the art of the hostile takeover. I acquired Vanguard Logistics specifically because I knew the company was rotting from the inside out. I knew Richard and Jason were bleeding the operational budget dry, but I did not rely on mere suspicion. I relied on undeniable documented proof. I gestured to the senior forensic accountant sitting to my right. He reached forward and flipped open the black folder. He distributed thick stacks of printed financial records to Richard, Jason, and Amanda. Barbara stretched her neck from her chair against the wall, desperately trying to see the papers. Her earlier bravado entirely vanished. Exactly 1 month before Apex Holdings initiated the hostile takeover, I authorized a comprehensive forensic audit of the Vanguard Logistics operational budgets. I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the long mahogany table. We did not simply look at your quarterly reports. My team gained deep access to your internal vendor routing systems, your expense accounts, and your third-party billing invoices. We spent 4 weeks tracing every single dollar that flowed through this department over the past 3 years. What we found was a masterclass in absolute financial incompetence and blatant criminal behavior. I turned my gaze away from Richard and locked eyes with Jason. My older brother was the golden child of the family. He was the boy who was given a brand new sports car, while I was told to find a second job. He was the man who filmed my mother pouring coffee on me yesterday for the amusement of his country club friends. He was staring down at the papers in front of him, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. "Let us begin with you, Regional Director Thorne," I said smoothly. "You have been running the Midwest Operations Division for 4 years. During that time, you reported record spending on external logistics vendors. You claimed that the supply chain required heavy investment in boutique transportation services. You convinced the previous board of directors that these exorbitant costs were entirely necessary to maintain our shipping routes." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face was losing color by the second. "Page 4 of the audit," I instructed, watching, as Jason mechanically turned the pages with trembling fingers. "You will see a detailed ledger of payments made to a company called Zenith Freight Solutions. Over the past 24 months, you personally authorized over $2 million in operational payments to this specific vendor. You approved the invoices. You bypassed the standard accounting protocols by citing executive privilege. You made sure Zenith Freight Solutions was paid promptly every single month. That is standard procedure for preferred vendors." Jason stammered, his voice sounding thin and weak. "We needed reliable transport. I made an executive call to secure the supply chain. It is all legitimate business." I smiled. It was a cold, practiced expression that sent a visible shiver down his spine. "Zenith Freight Solutions does not exist." "Jason," I said, clearly letting the words hang in the silent room, "there are no trucks. There are no shipping routes. There is no supply chain. It is a ghost company. It is a completely hollow shell corporation registered to a post office box in Delaware. And my forensic team found exactly who owns that post office box." I nodded to my attorney. He slid a certified bank document across the table directly into Jason's hands. "That is the incorporation paperwork for Zenith Freight Solutions," I continued. "You will notice that the primary listed beneficiary is a limited liability company registered under your wife and her maiden name. You will also notice the corresponding bank statements attached to the back of that packet. Every single dollar you authorized from Vanguard Logistics was routed through the Delaware Shell Company and deposited directly into your personal offshore accounts. You stole $2 million from this company to fund your luxury cars, your country club fees, and your miserable, pretentious lifestyle." The air in the boardroom grew thick and suffocating. Barbara let out a small, horrified gasp from her chair against the wall. She pressed her hands to her mouth, staring at her beloved son in absolute shock. Amanda looked terrified, shrinking back into her expensive chair as she realized the true severity of the situation. This was not a family dispute. This was a presentation of federal crimes. Jason began to sweat profusely. Beads of perspiration formed on his forehead and rolled down his temples. He frantically flipped through the bank statements, his eyes darting wildly across the highlighted account numbers and transfer dates. The undeniable proof of his guilt was staring him right in the face. The facade of the brilliant, successful golden boy shattered completely into a million pieces. "This is a mistake." Jason choked out, his voice rising in panic. "I did not do this. My team handles vendor approvals. My accounting managers process the invoices. They must have set this up without my knowledge. You are trying to frame me. You are setting me up because you are angry about the brunch yesterday." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished wood. "You are blaming your subordinates," I asked, my tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You are sitting here looking at documents bearing your direct digital signature and your personal authorization codes, and you are coward enough to throw your own team under the bus. We tracked the internet protocol addresses used to authorize those transfers, Jason. They originated from your personal laptop and your home network. You committed federal wire fraud. You embezzled millions of dollars from a corporate entity. And you left a digital paper trail so obvious that a first-year accounting student could have caught you." Jason looked like he was about to vomit. He tugged at his expensive silk tie, gasping for air. He looked desperately toward our father, his eyes pleading for salvation. "Dad, tell her," Jason begged, completely forgetting my strict instructions regarding titles. "Tell her this is a misunderstanding. You know how the vendor budgets work. You have to tell her." Richard had been staring at the audit papers in stunned silence. His chest heaved as he processed the reality of the trap I had sprung. He was a proud, arrogant man who had spent his entire life bullying his way out of difficult situations. He had never faced an opponent who held all the cards. He saw his golden son crumbling into a pathetic, sweating mess. The patriarchal instinct to protect his legacy and his favorite child overrode his basic common sense. Richard pushed his chair back and stood up, slamming his hands flat against the boardroom table. "You listen to me right now," Richard commanded, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are taking this entirely out of context. You do not understand how things work at this level of management. Jason did not steal anything. The logistics market is incredibly competitive. We had to move funds around to create slush accounts for expedited shipping bribes and off-the-book vendor incentives. It is a standard industry practice." My chief corporate counsel stiffened beside me, his pen freezing over his legal pad. The forensic accountant stared at Richard in sheer disbelief. Richard puffed out his chest, completely blind to the catastrophic error he was making. He truly believed he could talk his way out of a federal crime by exerting his dominance. He thought he could bully me into closing the investigation, just like he had bullied me when I was a child. "Those funds were reallocated to keep our supply lines moving," Richard declared loudly, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I know exactly where that money went, because I am the vice president of operations. I reviewed those vendor accounts myself. It was creative accounting. It was a strategic maneuver to bypass restrictive corporate red tape. Jason ran those accounts exactly the way I told him to run them. You are going to close this ridiculous audit right now, or I will take this to the press and tell everyone you are just a vindictive, unstable girl trying to ruin her family over a personal grudge." The silence that followed his outburst was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Jason looked at his father with a mixture of hope and terror. Barbara looked momentarily relieved, thinking her husband had just saved their son from ruin. I sat perfectly still. I did not show anger. I did not show fear. I slowly leaned back in my chair and let a wide, genuinely amused smile cross my face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a lethal snare. "Richard," I said softly, my voice perfectly clear. "Did you just state on the record that you had full knowledge of the Zenith Freight Solutions shell company? Did you just verbally confirm that you personally instructed your regional director to funnel corporate funds into offshore slush accounts using falsified vendor invoices?" Richard glared at me, his face red with arrogant fury. "I said I approved the creative accounting strategy," he snapped. "Because I run this department. I make the calls. And I am telling you that there was no fraud." I nodded slowly, letting my cold smile widen. "You approved the strategy," I repeated, ensuring every single syllable was enunciated clearly. "You bypassed corporate red tape. You authorized the falsification of financial documents." "That is right," Richard barked, crossing his arms over his chest. "And there is nothing you can do about it. You might own the company, but I control the narrative. I am the vice president. You are not going to touch my son." I turned to my chief corporate counsel. My attorney was looking at Richard with a mixture of professional awe and profound pity. I looked back at my father, the man who had poured a lifetime of abuse and rejection onto my shoulders. The man who had sat back and sipped a mimosa while his wife poured scalding coffee on my legs just 24 hours ago. "Thank you, Vice President Thorne," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "I appreciate your candor. You have just officially and verbally admitted to being a knowing accomplice to corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud." The silence in the room following Richard's disastrous admission was thick enough to choke on. I let him stew in the magnitude of his own stupidity for a long moment before I turned my attention away from his red, sweating face. It was time to deal with the youngest parasite at the table. I shifted my gaze to Amanda. My 30-year-old sister was sitting perfectly rigid in her plush designer chair. She had just watched her golden boy brother crumble into a pathetic, terrified mess. She had just witnessed our father verbally confess to a federal crime in front of a room full of highly paid corporate attorneys. But instead of realizing the sheer danger she was in, Amanda simply batted her eyelashes and adjusted her posture, falling back into the only defense mechanism she had ever known. She tried to play the innocent, untouchable princess who was somehow above the consequences of the real world. "Diana," she began, her voice taking on a whiny, pleading tone that used to work wonders on our parents whenever she wanted a new car or an expensive vacation. "You know I do not have anything to do with the accounting department. I am not a numbers person. I stay completely out of the operational side of the business. Whatever Jason and Dad were doing with those vendor accounts has absolutely nothing to do with me. I am just a creative professional. You cannot possibly drag me into this mess. We are sisters and you know I am innocent." I signaled to my senior employment attorney. He opened a sleek silver folder and extracted a perfectly crisp, heavily highlighted document. He placed it deliberately on the mahogany table right in front of my sister. I steepled my fingers, looking at her with absolute icy detachment. "You are quite right, Amanda," I said smoothly. "You are not a numbers person. You have absolutely no involvement in the operational logistics of this company. In fact, based on the comprehensive audit my team conducted over the past 4 weeks, you have absolutely no involvement in this company at all." Amanda stared at the document, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling slightly as she reached for it. It was a copy of her official employment contract with Vanguard Logistics, signed and dated by our father. "According to the human resources and payroll records of this corporation," I continued, my voice carrying across the silent room, "you were hired 3 years ago to fill the role of Vice President of Communications. Your starting base salary was $180,000 a year, not including your premium corporate health benefits, your matched retirement contributions, and the company-leased luxury vehicle you drove to this building today. You hold a senior executive title. You draw a massive executive salary. Yet my forensic team could not find a single shred of evidence that you have ever performed a single day of actual work." Amanda scoffed, rolling her eyes and tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She tried to muster a look of indignant superiority, falling back on the country club entitlement that had shielded her for her entire life. She truly believed that nepotism was an impenetrable shield against corporate accountability. "This is ridiculous," she huffed, crossing her arms tightly. "I am the face of the brand. I handle public relations and executive networking. My job is highly flexible. Just because I do not sit in a cubicle and push papers around all day like some miserable corporate drone does not mean I'm not working. Dad hired me because I understand the elite demographic this company targets. You are just trying to find a reason to pick on me because you have always resented my lifestyle." I did not react to her childish provocation. Instead, I nodded to the forensic accountant on my right. He produced 2 more thick reports and slid them across the table, placing them directly on top of Amanda's employment contract. "This is not a debate about your work style, Amanda," I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal, unyielding calm. "This is a presentation of your digital and physical footprint within this organization." The first stack of papers contains the keycard access logs for the Vanguard Logistics corporate headquarters. Security protocols require every employee, including senior executives, to swipe their badge to enter the building, access the elevators, and open the office suites. According to these logs, your keycard has not been used to enter this building in 14 consecutive months. Amanda swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward Richard for help, but our father was still paralyzed by his own catastrophic legal exposure. He offered her nothing but a blank, terrified stare. The second stack of papers I continued relentlessly forcing her attention back to the damning evidence on the table contains the information technology audit of your corporate accounts. My cybersecurity team tracked the login history for your official company email address and your virtual private network access portal. Over the past year, your corporate email account has received over 4,000 messages. You have replied to exactly 0 of them. Furthermore, your virtual private network profile has not registered a single login attempt from any external device. I leaned forward slightly, making sure she felt the full weight of my authority. You have not worked from home. You have not logged in from a coffee shop. You have not accessed the corporate servers to review a single document, approve a single press release, or communicate with a single member of the public relations team you supposedly lead. You are what corporate investigators call a ghost employee. You are a phantom siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the payroll while contributing absolutely nothing to the organization. The color rushed into Amanda's cheeks, turning her face a blotchy, angry red. The reality of the evidence was undeniable, but her towering ego refused to accept defeat. She slammed her hands down on the table, her diamond bracelets clanking loudly against the polished wood. "You do not know what you are talking about," she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of professional decorum. "I work from the country club. I entertain our top-tier clients. I host charity luncheons and network with the wives of the board members. I secure relationships that keep this company relevant in the circles that actually matter. You are just a bitter, jealous street rat." Her voice climbed an octave filled with years of unchecked entitlement and venomous spite. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You have always been jealous of me. You are just angry because you had to claw your way up from the gutter while I was born into luxury. You wish you had my life, Diana. You are just using your new little title to bully us, because you are still that pathetic, ugly girl that nobody in this family ever wanted." Her shrill voice echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could disappear into the floorboards. Barbara covered her face with her hands, letting out a quiet sob from her spectator chair against the wall. They knew Amanda had just dug her own grave, but the spoiled youngest child simply lacked the intellectual capacity to understand the gravity of her situation. She thought throwing a tantrum would bend the universe to her will, just as it always had. I sat perfectly still, absorbing her vicious insults without a single flinch. I let her catch her breath, allowing the sheer unprofessional ugliness of her outburst to settle heavily over the room. The corporate attorneys beside me watched her with absolute disgust. They were documenting every unhinged word for the official termination file. "Are you quite finished, Vice President of Communications?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Amanda glared at me, her chest heaving as she crossed her arms defensively. "You cannot fire me for networking," she snapped. "I am not firing you for networking," I replied smoothly. "I am terminating you for gross employment fraud and theft of corporate assets. You are not a brand ambassador. You are a thief who used your father's authority to siphon a fraudulent salary. And unlike your brother, who at least had the criminal ingenuity to set up a fake vendor company, your theft was lazy, arrogant, and entirely transparent." I reached into my black dossier one last time. I pulled out a single heavily formalized legal invoice printed on thick, watermarked paper. I handed it to my employment attorney, who slid it across the table until it rested directly under Amanda's trembling hands. "Look at that document, Amanda," I commanded. She looked down, her eyes scanning the bold numbers printed at the bottom of the page. The defiant anger in her face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her jaw dropped open and the breath hitched violently in her throat. Her eyes widened as she read the total balance due. "When Apex Holdings acquired Vanguard Logistics," I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority, "we also acquired the legal right to pursue financial damages against any employee engaged in verified fiscal misconduct." That document is a formal clawback invoice. It outlines the precise amount of unearned wages, misused company funds, and stolen corporate benefits that you have fraudulently collected over the past 14 months while providing zero services to this company. The total comes to exactly $210,000. Amanda let out a choked, terrified gasp. $210,000, she repeated, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. I do not have that kind of money. You know I do not have that kind of money. My accounts are tied up in my lifestyle. I spend my salary on my wardrobe and my club memberships. You cannot do this to me. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto hers with the predatory focus of a shark smelling blood in the water. I already did it, Amanda. As the chief executive officer of the parent company, and with the full backing of the corporate legal team sitting beside me, I have officially authorized the immediate garnishment of your accounts. My attorneys filed the necessary injunctions at 8 o'clock this morning. Your bank accounts are currently frozen. Your corporate credit cards have been deactivated. Every single dollar you possess will be legally seized to satisfy that debt to this company. You are no longer a wealthy socialite. As of this exact moment, you are instantly and completely bankrupt. Amanda stared at the heavy invoice resting in front of her. The staggering total of $210,000 seemed to burn directly into her retinas. The reality of her sudden, catastrophic bankruptcy shattered her delicate, pampered illusion of the world. She did not scream this time. She did not throw another tantrum about her luxury lifestyle or her country club networking events. She simply let out a pathetic, breathless whimper and sank back into her expensive leather chair, utterly defeated by the crushing weight of undeniable consequences. Richard watched his youngest daughter collapse into complete silence. He watched his golden boy son shivering and sweating profusely, paralyzed by the looming threat of federal prison and absolute ruin. The patriarchal empire Richard had ruled with an iron fist for 30 years was burning to the ground in a matter of minutes. He was cornered. He was facing total financial ruin, massive public disgrace, and the absolute destruction of his elite social standing. But Richard was a man who had never accepted defeat gracefully. When a narcissist is backed into a corner, they do not surrender. They do not apologize. They lash out. They turn incredibly vicious. They rely on the only weapon they have ever truly mastered: blackmail. Richard slowly pushed his chair back and stood up again. He adjusted his silk tie, desperately trying to project a commanding presence he no longer possessed. He looked down at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate malice. "You think you have won, Diana?" he sneered, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register that echoed in the quiet room. "You think a few printed spreadsheets and a couple of fancy corporate lawyers give you the power to destroy this family? But you are forgetting one very important detail. You might own this company now, but I know how to play the game better than you ever will. I have deep connections in this city. I have powerful friends in the local media. I have journalists on speed dial who owe me massive favors." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. "Are you threatening to go to the press, Richard?" I asked calmly. "Are you planning to call a press conference to announce your own federal wire fraud and embezzlement schemes to the entire world?" "I am planning to tell them the real story," Richard spat back, slamming his open hand hard onto the mahogany table. "I am going to tell them that the new chief executive officer of Apex Holdings is a bitter, vindictive, and severely mentally unstable woman. I will tell the world that you fabricated this entire audit out of pure childhood spite. I will say you orchestrated a baseless corporate witch hunt to punish your own family, because you could not handle the fact that we cut you off for your own good. I will paint you as a corporate tyrant who uses her newfound power to settle petty personal grudges. The media will eat it up. Your wealthy shareholders will panic. The stock price of Apex Holdings will plummet the second the market opens tomorrow morning." Barbara sensed the shift in tactics and immediately seized the opportunity to strike. She pushed herself away from the wall, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she stepped up to the table to stand beside her husband. The fake syrupy sweetness she had tried to use earlier was completely gone. Her eyes were hard and cold, filled with the same toxic cruelty she had used to break me down when I was a vulnerable child. "Your father is absolutely right," Barbara declared, pointing a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at me. If you do not stop this ridiculous charade right now, we will destroy your professional reputation. We will go on every daytime talk show and news network in the country. I will sit in front of the cameras and cry about my troubled, ungrateful youth of a daughter. I will tell everyone how we tried to give you a perfect, privileged life, but you were completely socially unfit. I will say you were always a disturbed child, constantly acting out, constantly causing unnecessary drama in our home, and completely incapable of fitting into polite society. She leaned closer over the table, a vicious, triumphant gleam shining in her eyes. I will tell them you are a pathological liar, Diana. I will say you suffered a massive mental breakdown at 18 and ran away because you adamantly refused to get psychiatric help. We will paint a picture of a deeply disturbed, ruthless executive who forged financial documents just to get back at the loving family she selfishly abandoned. Who do you think the public will believe? A respected corporate vice president and a devoted mother, or a cold, heartless corporate raider attacking her own flesh and blood? Your entire career will be over before the week is out. You will lose everything you have built. Richard nodded, emboldened by his wife joining the aggressive attack. You see, Diana, you do not hold all the cards. We can ruin you just as easily as you think you can ruin us. So here's exactly what is going to happen today. He placed his hands on his hips, trying to look like the undisputed master of the boardroom once again. You are going to take that thick black folder and you are going to feed it directly into the paper shredder. You are going to permanently delete every single digital copy of that ridiculous audit from your servers. Then you are going to draft a new employment contract for me and for Jason. We are going to retain our current executive titles, but you are going to give us a 20% pay bump to compensate us for the severe emotional distress you have caused us today. Amanda perked up from her chair, suddenly finding her voice again upon hearing the demand for money. And me, she demanded loudly. You are going to cancel that stupid invoice immediately and double my salary. Richard ignored her and kept his eyes locked on mine. Once the new contracts are signed, Richard continued outlining his absolute delusion. You are going to issue a formal public apology to this entire office. You will state that there was a massive misunderstanding regarding the accounting department and that you completely overreacted. You will restore our good names and you will back off entirely. If you refuse to meet these specific terms, Barbara and I will walk straight out of this building and directly to the press. We will drag your name through the mud until the board of directors at Apex Holdings is forced to fire you just to save their own public relations nightmare. You have exactly 1 minute to make your choice. I listened to their elaborate extortion attempt without interrupting a single word. I did not show an ounce of fear. I did not display a flicker of panic. I simply sat there watching them dig their graves deeper and deeper with every threat they uttered. They truly believed they had outsmarted me. They genuinely believed their toxic family manipulation tactics would actually work in the high-stakes arena of corporate warfare. They thought they could bully a chief executive officer with the same tactics they used to bully a helpless teenager. Are you quite finished? I asked, my voice carrying a terrifying absolute calm that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Richard scowled, his face hardening. I am waiting for your answer, Diana. Shred the folder or we destroy your life right now. I did not reach for the black folder. I did not speak to the corporate attorneys sitting beside me. I simply reached out and pressed a small silver button located on the digital control panel built into the center of my desk. The room remained completely silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the massive 90-inch screen mounted on the wall directly behind me suddenly flared to life. The high-definition display illuminated the entire boardroom, casting a bright, cold glow over Richard and Barbara. The screen split into 12 separate video feeds. 12 distinguished men and women dressed in immaculate business attire stared out from the massive screen. They were sitting in various opulent offices across the globe, their expressions universally grim, silent, and unyielding. It was the full board of directors of Apex Holdings. They had been connected to the boardroom audio feed since the exact moment my family walked through the glass double doors. They had listened to every single word. They had heard Jason try to blame his subordinates for his theft. They had heard Amanda scream about her country club lifestyle. And most importantly, they had just listened to Richard and Barbara outline a highly detailed premeditated plan to commit corporate extortion and blackmail against their chief executive officer. They had documented every threat. The silence in the boardroom was absolute as the 12 massive video squares illuminated the space. For a fleeting moment, Richard simply stared at the high-definition monitors, his mind completely unable to process the magnitude of the trap he had just walked into. The men and women on the screen were the ultimate power brokers of Apex Holdings. They were the billionaire investors, the global strategists, and the institutional shareholders who actually owned every single asset within the Vanguard Logistics portfolio. Sitting directly in the center square of the grid was Chairman Harrison. He was a ruthless, seasoned corporate veteran known for dismantling corrupt executive boards with surgical precision. Chairman Harrison leaned forward toward his camera, steepling his fingers on his desk. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. "Good morning, Vice President Thorne," Chairman Harrison said, his deep voice projecting through the boardroom's surround sound speakers with crystal clarity. "We have been connected to this meeting since the moment you and your family walked through the glass double doors. We utilized the muted audio function to observe the leadership transition without interrupting our new chief executive officer. However, we certainly did not expect to be treated to a live, unscripted confession of corporate embezzlement, followed immediately by an incredibly clumsy attempt at executive extortion." The blood drained from Richard completely. His face, which had been flushed with arrogant fury just seconds prior, turned a sickening shade of ash gray. His mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords entirely failed him. "You see, Richard," Chairman Harrison continued relentlessly, "we heard every single word you just said to Diana. We heard you verbally confirm that you authorized your son to create falsified vendor accounts. We heard you admit to hiding corporate funds to bypass our standard operating procedures. And most shockingly, we listened as you threatened to launch a fabricated media smear campaign against Diana unless she agreed to cover up a federal crime and double your salaries. In my 40 years of corporate governance, I have never witnessed a senior executive commit career suicide quite so spectacularly. Your arrogance has permanently blinded you to reality." Barbara was completely paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare. The vicious, triumphant gleam that had lit up her eyes just moments ago had completely vanished. She slowly lowered her pointing finger and took a staggering step backward, gripping her leather chair for physical support. She looked at the screens, realizing with absolute horror that her threats of going on daytime television and crying about her socially unfit daughter had just been broadcast to global billionaires. The toxic, manipulative tactics she had successfully used to control our family narrative for 3 decades were entirely useless here. She could not bully these people. She could not guilt-trip them. She could not charm her way out of this room. The country club armor she wore was nothing but cheap plastic in the face of true institutional power. Chairman Harrison shifted his stern gaze through the camera, looking directly at my mother. "And you must be Barbara," he noted coldly. "Please understand that any attempt to defame our chief executive officer will be met with the full devastating force of our international legal division. We have meticulously recorded your threats of blackmail. If you whisper a negative word to the press about Diana, we will bury you under a mountain of defamation lawsuits so massive you will not be able to afford your country club dues. We will pursue damages until you have absolutely nothing left to your name." The power dynamic in the room shifted with a violent, permanent finality. The illusion of parental authority completely evaporated. Richard was no longer a demanding patriarch. Barbara was no longer a controlling matriarch. They were simply two cornered, desperate individuals who had vastly overestimated their own intelligence. Jason had curled into a tight ball in his chair, quietly weeping into his trembling hands as the reality of his impending federal indictment crashed over him. Amanda sat frozen like a statue, staring blankly at the massive clawback invoice resting on the mahogany table. They were completely trapped. They had absolutely no leverage left to utilize. Every single threat they had made was now weaponized evidence against them. I stood up from my chair at the head of the table. I smoothed the front of my black turtleneck, commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room. The board members on the screens fell silent, deferring entirely to my authority. I looked down at the pathetic, trembling remnants of the family that had discarded me 16 years ago. As the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings, I am officially concluding the internal investigation into the Vanguard Logistics Operations Department. I announced, my voice carrying the sharp, unyielding edge of absolute corporate authority. The evidence of gross financial misconduct, systemic payroll fraud, and attempted executive extortion is undeniable and fully documented on the official record. I turned my cold gaze to my older brother, who adamantly refused to lift his face from his hands. Jason, you are officially terminated from your position as regional director, effective immediately. Your termination is for cause, citing gross misconduct, embezzlement of corporate funds, and federal wire fraud. Human Resources will process your exit paperwork, but you will not be receiving a positive reference from this institution. I pivoted to my younger sister. She shrank back into her padded seat as my shadow fell over her. Amanda, you are officially terminated from your position as Vice President of Communications effective immediately. Your termination is for cause, specifically citing employment fraud, theft of corporate assets, and chronic absenteeism. You are required to surrender your corporate vehicle keys and your building access badge before you leave this floor today. Finally, I turned my attention to the man who had orchestrated the entire toxic empire. Richard forced himself to look at me, his eyes wide with a desperate pleading I had never seen him display before. Richard, I said, delivering the final fatal blow to his massive ego. You are officially terminated from your position as Vice President of Operations effective immediately. Your termination is for cause, specifically citing the direct facilitation of corporate fraud, failure to uphold fiduciary duties, and the attempted extortion of a superior officer. You are no longer employees of this prestigious organization. You no longer hold any authority within these corporate walls. You are completely stripped of your titles, your operational access, and your corporate protection. The finality of the termination hung heavy in the frigid boardroom air. Richard felt his legs completely give out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into his chair, his broad shoulders slumping forward in total defeat. The arrogant tyrant was gone. In his place sat a broken, terrified 60-year-old man staring directly into the dark abyss of absolute financial ruin. He looked up at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The blustering threats were completely replaced by desperate, humiliating begging. "Diana, please." Richard choked out, his voice cracking violently in the quiet room. "You cannot do this to me. I am 60 years old. I have dedicated my entire adult life to this specific industry. I am far too old to start over from the bottom. If you fire me like this, no reputable company will ever hire me again. My professional reputation will be completely destroyed." He reached his arms across the table, his hands trembling violently as he pleaded for mercy from the very daughter he had treated like garbage. "What about my severance package?" he begged, his eyes darting frantically toward the attorneys sitting perfectly still beside me. "I have a massive executive parachute written into my contract. I have a company pension. I have millions of dollars in unvested stock options waiting for me. You have to let me keep my retirement funds. If you take the money, we will lose the house. We will lose our country club memberships. We will lose absolutely everything we have worked for. You cannot possibly leave your own father out on the street with absolutely nothing to his name. Please, Diana, I am begging you to show some mercy." I looked down at the man who had allowed my mother to pour scalding coffee on my legs just 24 hours ago. I looked at the man who had cut me off at 18 and told me I was a worthless failure who would never amount to anything in this world. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no remorse, none. I did not flinch. I did not soften my expression. I reached back into my black leather portfolio. I pulled out a brand new, heavily watermarked legal document bearing the official seal of the Apex Holdings legal department. I placed it flat on the mahogany table and used 2 fingers to slowly slide it across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of my father. "Mercy is a privilege reserved for the innocent, Richard," I said coldly. "And you are entirely guilty." I watched Richard pick up the heavily watermarked document with violently trembling hands. His eyes darted across the bold legal print, his lips moving silently, as he read the specific clauses that were systematically dismantling his entire financial future. The corporate attorney sitting beside me had drafted this exact termination agreement with absolute airtight precision. When a senior executive is terminated without cause, they are typically entitled to a massive golden parachute. They walk away with millions of dollars in severance pay and full access to their vested benefits. But when an executive is terminated for documented verified corporate fraud and gross embezzlement, the rules completely change. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands neatly on the table. That document is a formal legal notification of your termination for cause, I explained, making sure the highly sensitive microphone picked up every single word for the board of directors still watching on the large screen behind me. Under Section 4 of your executive employment contract, any verifiable engagement in financial misconduct immediately and permanently nullifies your entire severance package. Your expected $5 million payout is entirely voided. Furthermore, because you actively utilized corporate resources to cover up federal wire fraud, the board of directors has officially voted to freeze and void every single one of your unvested stock options. Richard dropped the paper as if it had physically burned his fingers. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pallid gray. Your corporate pension has been indefinitely suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation into your department, I continued flawlessly. Your company-sponsored health insurance is canceled effective at 5 o'clock today. You will be held personally liable for the repayment of any funds you diverted. You are leaving this company with absolutely nothing, Richard. The golden parachute you were counting on has been completely slashed and burned. He looked like he was suffocating in his expensive tailored suit. He tried to speak to offer some kind of rebuttal or defense, but only a raspy, defeated wheeze escaped his dry throat. The realization that he was suddenly penniless hit him with the devastating force of a freight train. The arrogant tyrant who had ruled our household and this company for decades was completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. The shockwave of this massive financial annihilation rippled across the silent boardroom and slammed directly into Barbara. My mother had spent her entire adult life relying exclusively on Richard and his bloated corporate salary to fund her extravagant, pretentious lifestyle. She had never worked a single day in her life. She defined her entire existence by her exclusive address in the wealthy Chicago suburbs, the designer labels hanging in her massive walk-in closet, and her highly coveted status at the Oakbrook Country Club. Barbara began to visibly hyperventilate. Her chest heaved dramatically beneath her bright yellow designer dress. She looked wildly at Richard, waiting for him to contradict me. She waited for him to pull some miraculous legal loophole out of thin air to save their massive wealth and protect her social standing. But Richard just sat there, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, completely and utterly broken by the reality of his own actions. "Diana, you cannot be serious!" Barbara gasped, her voice shrill and trembling with genuine unfiltered panic. "Do you have any idea what this actually means for us? If Richard loses his pension and his stock options, we will not be able to pay the mortgage on the estate. The property taxes alone are astronomical. We will lose the house. We will lose the luxury cars we just leased. The country club membership dues are required by the end of this month. If we miss that payment, we will be permanently expelled from the social register. My charity luncheons, my gala committees, everything will be gone. Our friends will find out. We will be absolutely ruined in this city. We will have nowhere to go and no one to help us." I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of cold satisfaction at her sheer, undeniable terror. "That sounds like a personal financial crisis, Barbara," I said smoothly, my tone devoid of any empathy. As a corporate entity, Apex Holdings is not legally or morally responsible for your lavish personal spending habits or your massive suburban mortgage. I highly suggest you start looking for a much smaller apartment on the other side of town. When corporate logic and aggressive intimidation completely failed her, Barbara immediately reverted to the only psychological weapon she had left in her empty arsenal. She fell back on the toxic emotional manipulation she had consistently used to control me during my entire childhood. She pushed herself away from the wall and walked toward the edge of the large table. She forced large crocodile tears to well up in her eyes, desperately trying to play the role of the heartbroken, betrayed mother who was being victimized by her own cruel offspring. "How can you do this to the people who gave you life?" Barbara cried, her voice cracking with highly practiced forced emotion. "We are your parents, Diana. We brought you into this world. We put a solid roof over your head when you were small. We fed you and clothed you for 18 long years. We paid for every single thing you needed when you were a growing child. Do you remember the school supplies we bought you? Do you remember the doctor visits we paid for? We sacrificed our own valuable time and our hard-earned energy to raise you properly. You owe us your basic respect. You owe us extreme gratitude for keeping you alive until you were a legal adult." She reached out over the vast expanse of the table, trying to grab my hand to force a physical, emotional connection, but I pulled my hand back swiftly, absolutely refusing to let her touch my skin. "You cannot just throw us out onto the street like discarded garbage," Barbara sobbed, turning her head to appeal to the wealthy board members watching silently on the screen behind me. "We gave you everything we had. We supported you financially for your entire childhood. You are our flesh and blood. You are morally obligated to help us now that we are older and facing a severe crisis. You cannot strip away our livelihood after everything we spent to give you a decent normal life. It is unnatural. It is incredibly cruel to punish your own loving mother and father this way over a simple misunderstanding at a brunch." I sat perfectly still, letting her hysterical, manipulative monologue echo through the cold, silent boardroom. I listened to her boldly claim that they had sacrificed their wealth for my benefit. I listened to her demand endless gratitude for providing the absolute bare minimum legal requirements of parenthood before aggressively kicking me out the exact second I turned 18. I listened to her try to weaponize the concept of maternal love after she had spent decades making me feel like an unwanted burden. Her breathtaking hypocrisy was the final nail in her own coffin. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or argue with her deeply twisted version of our family history. I simply reached back into my black leather briefcase one final time. I bypassed the sleek corporate dossiers, the heavy legal contracts, and the thick forensic audit reports. Instead, I pulled out a single severely weathered piece of paper enclosed in a clear plastic protective sleeve. It was an incredibly old, deeply faded bank statement from 16 years ago. I had uncovered this specific historical document weeks ago during the rigorous financial background checks my firm conducted on the Vanguard Logistics executive staff. Finding this piece of paper had shifted this entire hostile takeover from a purely professional business transaction into a deeply personal mission for absolute justice. I placed the plastic sleeve flat on the table, resting my hand lightly over the faded black ink. The room grew so quiet that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. "You claim that you paid for my life, Barbara?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that commanded the absolute undivided attention of every single person in the room. "You stand in this corporate office and demand my undying gratitude because you believe you financed my existence until I was 18 years old. You claim you sacrificed your own wealth to give me a future and keep me safe. You claim I owe you for the clothes on my back and the food on my plate." I looked at Jason, who was still weeping softly into his hands, completely oblivious to his mother's performance. Then I looked directly into my mother's panicked, searching eyes. I slid the weathered bank statement across the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of my mother. "Let us talk about who actually paid for who." I watched my mother stare at the faded piece of paper enclosed in the clear plastic sleeve. The heavy silence in the boardroom stretched out, amplifying the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the digital clock on the wall. Barbara had just spent the last 5 minutes sobbing, demanding my gratitude, and viciously claiming that she and Richard had sacrificed their own financial well-being to keep me alive. She had tried to weaponize the basic biological obligations of motherhood to make me feel guilty for terminating their employment. But that specific piece of paper resting on the polished mahogany table was about to destroy the very foundation of her maternal martyrdom. I placed my index finger on the top of the plastic sleeve and slowly slid it completely out of her reach, bringing it back to the center of the table where everyone could see it clearly. This document is not a Vanguard Logistics corporate expense report, I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, relentless clarity. This is a certified financial record from a private banking institution dated exactly 16 years ago. It is a detailed ledger from a high-yield savings trust that was established by my late grandparents shortly before they passed away. They explicitly designed this specific trust to function as a dedicated college fund. My grandfather was very clear in his legal instructions. That money was meant to ensure that his oldest granddaughter would have the financial resources to pursue a higher education without drowning in student loan debt. The initial deposit, complete with accumulated interest, totaled exactly $50,000. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The aggressive, bullying posture he had desperately tried to maintain throughout the meeting was entirely gone now. A thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He knew exactly what that piece of paper was, and he knew exactly what it proved. Barbara, however, still looked completely confused. She was so deeply entrenched in her own delusions of parental grandeur that she genuinely could not comprehend how a 16-year-old bank statement could possibly threaten her current reality. When I turned 18, I continued keeping my eyes locked onto my mother. You both sat me down in the living room of your massive suburban estate. You told me that I was a bitter disappointment. You said my refusal to join the country club elite made me a social liability. You packed my belongings into trash bags, threw me out the front door, and explicitly told me that I would never receive a single dime of family money for college or anything else. You told me the family accounts were completely empty and that I had to fend for myself. I believed you. I spent the next 4 years working grueling night shifts, waiting tables, and scrubbing floors just to pay my basic tuition and afford a cramped, freezing apartment. I ate cheap instant noodles while studying until dawn because I honestly believed my family had no money to spare for my education. I picked up the document and held it up to the light. But the money was always there. The $50,000 trust fund my grandparents left entirely in my name was fully funded and ready to be dispersed the exact week I turned 18. But I never saw a single penny of it. According to these certified bank transfer logs, Richard utilized his status as my legal guardian to drain the entire trust fund exactly 2 days before my 18th birthday. Jason suddenly stopped crying. He lifted his face from his hands, his bloodshot eyes darting nervously toward our father. The golden boy of the family was finally starting to realize that his entire life of luxury had been financed by systematic theft. You did not use that money to pay for household expenses, Barbara, I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, unyielding whisper. You did not use it to put food on the table or keep a roof over my head like you just so loudly claimed. I traced the highlighted transaction lines on the paper with my red pen. Richard transferred the entire $50,000 balance directly into his own private checking account. 48 hours later, he initiated 2 massive wire transfers. The first transfer was for $42,000, sent directly to an upscale luxury car dealership in downtown Chicago to purchase a brand new sports car. The second transfer was for $8,000, sent directly to a university fraternity house to cover premium membership dues and exclusive housing fees. I lowered the paper and stared directly into my mother's horrified, wide eyes. You stole my entire future to buy your golden boy a sports car, I stated with absolute terrifying calm. You threw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing, claiming you were broke while you literally used my inheritance to fund Jason's extravagant college lifestyle. You did not sacrifice your wealth for me. You did not pay for my life. I paid for his. The truth hung in the freezing air of the boardroom like a physical weight. Barbara stared at the bank statement, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. For the first time in her entire life, she was completely stripped of her ability to play the victim. The undeniable paper trail proved that her entire maternal narrative was a calculated, malicious lie. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to produce some kind of brilliant excuse that would make them look like the good guys again. But Richard simply stared at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter. It was not my fault, Jason suddenly blurted out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. The golden boy could not handle the crushing pressure of the room. He frantically pointed a shaking finger at our father. Dad told me he earned that money from a massive corporate bonus. I was just a college student. I did not know the money came from your trust fund, Diana. I swear I had absolutely no idea where the cash came from. Dad just handed me the keys to the sports car and told me he was rewarding me for getting accepted into the fraternity. You cannot blame me for driving a car my father bought for me. The fragile, unified front my family had tried to maintain completely fractured into a million jagged pieces. They were no longer a proud elite family fighting against a rogue daughter. They were just a pack of cornered, desperate animals, perfectly willing to tear each other to shreds to save their own skins. Richard violently snapped. His head whipped around and he glared at his favorite son with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He slammed his hand flat against the table, making Jason flinch hard in his padded chair. "Shut your mouth, you pathetic idiot!" Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. "Do not you dare sit there and try to blame me for your miserable failures. I gave you everything. I bought you that car because you threw a massive tantrum and threatened to drop out of school if you did not get it. I handed you a regional director job that you were completely unqualified for. I showed you exactly how to bypass the corporate accounting software to fund your lavish lifestyle. I covered up your massive mistakes for 4 years. And how do you repay me? You leave a digital paper trail so incredibly obvious that it destroys my entire career. I am losing my pension and my unvested stock options because you were too stupid to cover your own tracks properly. You ruined my life today." Amanda shrank back into her expensive leather chair, pressing her hands tightly over her ears as her father and brother screamed vicious, unforgiving insults at each other across the massive boardroom table. The pristine corporate environment had been completely reduced to a pathetic, chaotic shouting match. Barbara simply buried her face in her trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. She wept loudly, realizing with devastating clarity that her perfect suburban empire had just violently imploded right in front of her eyes. Her country club friends would soon know the truth. The toxic family dynamic had completely collapsed under the sheer weight of its own unrelenting greed, entitlement, and blinding incompetence. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, watching them ruthlessly tear each other apart without an ounce of loyalty. The corporate attorneys and forensic accountants sitting beside me observed the chaotic, miserable scene in stunned, absolute silence. They had never witnessed a family destroy itself quite so thoroughly. I had won the war. I had systematically stripped away their wealth, their unearned titles, their arrogance, and their completely fake unity. I had finally secured the justice I deserved. I slowly lifted my left arm and checked the face of my silver watch, noting the precise time of their downfall. I cleared my throat, the sharp sound instantly cutting through their bitter, screaming argument and bringing the room to a sudden halt. "This meeting is officially over," I announced, my voice slicing through the room like a cold steel blade. "Corporate security personnel are waiting outside the door right now, and they will physically escort you directly to your empty desks to collect your personal items. You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my building before I have you arrested for trespassing." The massive glass doors of the boardroom swung open the exact second my 5-minute warning hung in the freezing air. The head of Apex Holdings Corporate Security stepped into the room. He was a broad-shouldered veteran who carried an air of absolute authority, and he was flanked by 4 heavily built guards in dark suits. They moved with practiced military precision, immediately surrounding the 4 people who had just watched their entire empire burn to ashes. "Time is up," the head of security announced, his voice, a deep baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. "Stand up and move toward the exit immediately." Richard tried to summon one last ounce of his patriarchal dignity. He slowly pushed himself up from his chair, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with trembling fingers. He looked at me one final time, searching for a microscopic trace of hesitation or regret in my eyes. He found nothing but a cold, impenetrable wall of corporate justice. He lowered his gaze to the floor and took a heavy, defeated step toward the door. Barbara stumbled after him, her bright yellow designer dress looking utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of her complete financial ruin. She was still weeping into her hands, entirely unable to face the reality of the situation. Jason and Amanda followed like terrified prisoners, their earlier arrogance entirely replaced by sheer suffocating dread. The security team marched them out of the boardroom and directly onto the main operations floor of Vanguard Logistics. This was the exact floor where Richard and Jason had ruled as undisputed tyrants for over a decade. It was an expansive open-plan office filled with hundreds of cubicles, glass-walled meeting rooms, and busy administrative hubs. Usually, the floor was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting managers, and frantic logistics coordinators. But today, the entire floor was completely and utterly silent. Word of the hostile takeover and the sudden boardroom tribunal had spread through the corporate communication channels like wildfire. Hundreds of employees were standing at their desks. These were the dedicated project managers Jason had verbally abused to cover up his sheer incompetence. These were the honest accountants Richard had violently bullied into signing off on highly questionable expense reports year after year. These were the hard-working, drastically underpaid staff members who had watched Amanda parade through the lobby twice a year to collect a massive paycheck for a completely fabricated job. Now those hundreds of employees stood in absolute silence, watching the untouchable Golden family being marched through the aisles by armed security guards. The collective gaze of the office was a heavy, suffocating weight. There were no sympathetic murmurs. There were no sad goodbyes. There were only cold, highly satisfied stares from the people who had suffered under their toxic, narcissistic management for years. The security detail escorted Richard and Jason to their respective corner offices and handed them flat, unassembled cardboard boxes. They were strictly instructed to pack only their personal non-company items. Richard moved like a broken machine, silently placing framed photographs and cheap golf trophies into his box. He could feel the eyes of his former subordinates burning a hole directly into his back. The absolute humiliation of packing his desk under the watchful eye of a stoic security guard was a devastating blow to his massive ego. He was no longer the feared, untouchable vice president. He was just a disgraced, broken old man being thrown out onto the street. While Richard and Jason packed their offices, Amanda found herself standing awkwardly in the center aisle. Because she was a phantom employee who never actually came to work, she did not have a dedicated office or a personal desk to pack. However, her towering sense of blind entitlement refused to let her leave the building empty-handed. She marched over to an empty executive suite and aggressively grabbed a top-of-the-line, highly expensive corporate laptop resting on a docking station. She shoved the silver computer into her oversized designer handbag and then reached for a beautiful custom-made crystal desk sculpture. "Put that down immediately," a security guard ordered, stepping directly into Amanda's path and blocking her exit. Amanda rolled her eyes and let out a harsh, indignant scoff. "Excuse me," she snapped, her spoiled attitude flaring up in front of the watching staff. "I am a vice president of this company. This is my personal equipment. I need this laptop to manage my elite contact lists and my digital portfolios. You have absolutely no right to touch my belongings. Move out of my way right now before I have my father fire you." The guard did not move a single inch. He reached forward, clamped a firm hand onto the handle of her designer bag, and smoothly extracted the silver laptop. He then took the crystal sculpture directly out of her other hand. "You are no longer an employee of this organization," he stated loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the silent office floor. "All electronic devices, data storage units, and office decor are strictly classified as corporate property. You are attempting to commit corporate theft. You will leave this floor with exactly what you brought in, or I will officially detain you for the authorities." Amanda gasped, her face turning a bright, blotchy red. Several employees standing nearby actually let out quiet, highly satisfied chuckles at her embarrassing public reprimand. The untouchable princess was being treated like a common shoplifter in front of the entire operational staff. She stamped her foot against the carpet, letting out a frustrated shriek, but the guard simply pointed his finger toward the elevator bank, completely unmoved by her pathetic tantrum. The security team gathered the broken family and marched them toward the main lobby elevators. Richard carried a single half-empty cardboard box. Jason clutched a small canvas bag of personal items, his face still slick with cold, nervous sweat. Barbara clung desperately to Richard's arm, hiding her tear-stained face behind her large sunglasses to shield herself from the judging stares of the employees. Amanda stomped aggressively ahead of them, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, quietly fuming at the profound indignity of being denied her stolen corporate hardware. They stepped into the large glass elevator. The security detail joined them, pressing the glowing button for the ground floor lobby. As the heavy elevator rapidly descended, the grim reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate Jason's thick skull. The golden boy was rapidly processing the devastating fact that he was leaving the building with no job, no severance package, no hidden offshore accounts, and absolutely no future. The protective, golden bubble his father had carefully constructed around him had been completely obliterated. The sheer suffocating pressure of his massive failure reached a violent, explosive boiling point. The moment the elevator doors chimed and slid open on the ground floor, Jason completely snapped. His deep-seated arrogance and profound emotional immaturity violently collided. He stepped out of the elevator, dropped his canvas bag, and let out a primal, furious scream. "This is completely ridiculous!" Jason roared, his voice echoing loudly through the massive marble lobby of the Vanguard Logistics building. "You cannot do this to me. I am a regional director. I built the entire Midwest division with my own bare hands. You need me to run this company." He turned around and aggressively shoved one of the corporate security guards hard in the chest. The guard barely moved, but the physical escalation was an incredibly stupid, highly dangerous maneuver. The guard instantly stepped forward, his hand dropping directly toward his utility belt, but Jason was already spinning totally out of control. He marched blindly toward the center of the lobby, completely consumed by his own destructive, entitled rage. He approached a massive, highly expensive digital display board that showcased the corporate logistics network. With a violent, sweeping motion of his arm, Jason shoved the heavy display stand. The massive metal structure toppled backward, crashing against the polished marble floor with a deafening, shattering sound. Expensive glass and cracked plastic scattered wildly across the pristine lobby. Jason stood over the broken display, his chest heaving, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He glared fiercely at the security guards, practically daring them to do something about his destructive tantrum. He thought he was proving his dominance. He thought he was showing everyone in the building that he could not be easily dismissed or controlled by his estranged younger sister. But Jason was looking in the wrong direction. He was so deeply focused on intimidating the corporate security team that he completely failed to notice the main entrance doors sliding open behind him. He failed to see the flashing red and blue emergency lights reflecting brightly against the glass facade of the building. And he completely failed to notice the two uniformed police officers stepping purposefully into the corporate lobby. The officers did not look at the shattered display on the floor. They did not look at the angry, shouting man standing in the center of the room. They walked with steady, determined purpose directly toward the security desk. "We are looking for Jason Thorne," the lead officer announced, his deep voice cutting sharply through the tense atmosphere of the lobby. Jason froze entirely. The fiery, aggressive rage drained out of his body in a single terrifying instant. He slowly turned around, his expensive dress shoes crunching against the broken glass on the marble floor. He stared blankly at the two armed officers, his breath hitching violently in his throat. "I am Jason Thorne," he managed to whisper, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. The officers stepped forward, moving with practiced, relentless efficiency. They were not responding to a call about property damage or a minor lobby disturbance. They were acting on highly sensitive, federally certified information that had been systematically processed and legally approved exactly 3 hours ago. The meticulous forensic audit I had compiled had proven far too dangerous to simply keep within the confines of a corporate termination file. The lead officer reached directly to his utility belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The distinct metallic clinking sound echoed loudly across the silent marble lobby, sealing the absolute destruction of the golden boy. Jason Thorne, the officer said firmly, reaching out to grasp my brother's trembling wrist. You are under arrest for felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Jason stared at the silver handcuffs as if they were alien artifacts. The heavy steel caught the bright natural light streaming through the massive glass windows of the corporate lobby. He did not pull his arm away. He was completely frozen, trapped in a waking nightmare that had escalated far beyond a simple corporate firing. His mouth opened and closed, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the dry deck of a boat. The sheer, terrifying reality of the criminal justice system had just violently collided with his lifelong bubble of absolute privilege. Wait! Jason finally choked out, his voice cracking so severely it sounded like a frantic whisper. There is a huge mistake here. You are arresting me for the broken display screen. I can pay for the screen right now. I have the money to cover the property damage. You do not understand who my father is. He is the vice president of this entire building. He can write a check for the damages today. Please just let me get my wallet. The lead officer did not even blink at the pathetic, desperate attempt at bribery. He gripped Jason by the upper arm, effortlessly spinning the grown man around and pressing him face first against the polished marble wall. He pulled Jason's arms firmly behind his back. The sharp, mechanical clicking sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent, expansive lobby. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of the golden boy losing his freedom. We are not here for a broken television monitor, Mr. Thorne, the second officer stated calmly, stepping forward to assist his partner. We are here executing a federal warrant issued directly by the district attorney this morning. The legal department of Apex Holdings formally handed over a comprehensive financial audit to the authorities at 6 in the morning today. We have certified bank statements, routed internet protocols, and verified digital signatures, proving you funneled millions of corporate dollars into a Delaware shell company. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Jason let out a strangled, high-pitched sob. He pressed his wet, tear-stained cheek against the cold marble wall as the officer recited his rights. The timeline the officer just revealed completely shattered whatever tiny shred of hope Jason had left. The audit had been handed over to the police before the family even arrived for the morning meeting. I had not called the authorities in response to his temper tantrum. I had strategically orchestrated his arrest hours before I ever stepped foot into the boardroom. The trap was set in stone before he even finished drinking his morning coffee. No, no, no! Jason wailed, his knees buckling slightly as the officers supported his weight. You cannot do this to me. I am a good person. I am a regional director. I did not mean to steal anything. My dad told me to do it. Ask my dad. He is standing right there. He told me to set up the accounts. He was crying hysterically now, completely abandoning his father to save his own skin. The utter cowardice of his reaction was on full display for the entire lobby to witness. Richard stood paralyzed near the elevator banks. He watched his favorite son crying and begging in handcuffs, throwing him under the bus to armed police officers. But Richard did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not try to exert his patriarchal dominance over the local authorities. The crushing weight of his own impending legal ruin kept his feet glued to the floor. He knew that any sudden movements or aggressive interference would only guarantee his own immediate arrest. The once terrifying corporate titan was reduced to a silent, cowardly bystander watching his legacy burn to ash. Barbara, however, possessed absolutely zero situational awareness. The country club matriarch had spent her entire life shielding her golden boy from the consequences of his own actions. She had bribed his high school teachers for better grades. She had aggressively threatened his college professors when he failed exams. She was entirely programmed to believe that her loud, entitled outrage could alter reality and bend the rigid rules of society to her will. Seeing her precious son locked in steel handcuffs caused something in her brain to completely snap. Barbara dropped her expensive designer handbag onto the floor. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the lobby. She sprinted across the marble floor, her bright yellow dress flying wildly behind her, her high heels clicking frantically as she charged directly at the two armed police officers. Get your filthy hands off my son! Barbara screamed at the top of her lungs, her face contorting into an ugly mask of feral, unhinged rage. You let him go right now. Do you have any idea who we are? We are the Thorne family. We belong to the Oak Brook Country Club. We know the mayor. We know the chief of police. You cannot arrest him. He is a good boy. He comes from a wealthy, respectable family. She threw herself forward aggressively, shoving the shoulder of the second police officer in a completely delusional attempt to physically free Jason. It was a monumentally stupid, incredibly dangerous decision. Madam, step back immediately, the officer barked, holding his hand up in a firm defensive posture. If you interfere with an active federal arrest, you will be charged with assaulting a police officer and obstruction of justice. Move back right now. Barbara completely ignored the direct legal warning. She was blinded by her toxic, enabling maternal rage. She reached out and clawed wildly at the officer's uniform, trying to wedge herself between the police and her weeping son. He did not steal anything. Barbara shrieked, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face. He was just doing what his father told him to do. It was creative accounting. It is a completely normal business practice. You are just targeting him because my jealous, vindictive daughter lied to you. She is trying to ruin our perfect family. Let him go. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He realized with absolute horror that his wife was seconds away from catching a felony assault charge in front of a dozen witnesses. He rushed forward, grabbing Barbara forcefully by the waist and violently hauling her backward away from the officers. "Stop it, Barbara," Richard yelled, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Are you insane? Shut your mouth right now. You are going to get us all thrown in jail." He wrapped his arms tightly around her, physically restraining her as she thrashed and kicked against him. Barbara sobbed hysterically, her carefully maintained image of elite country club sophistication completely obliterated. She looked like a wild, deranged woman screaming in the middle of a corporate lobby. Her expensive yellow dress was twisted. Her hair was completely disheveled. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. The facade of the perfect, untouchable suburban matriarch had been thoroughly destroyed. Amanda stood by the shattered remnants of the digital display board, watching the violent, chaotic scene unfold with her mouth hanging wide open. She hugged her arms tightly across her chest, trying to make herself as physically small as possible. The spoiled princess had finally realized that crying and demanding special treatment would not save her here. She watched her brother being read his rights. She watched her mother attacking a police officer. She watched her father struggling to maintain basic order. The realization that she was completely and utterly bankrupt finally set in, leaving her shivering in the cold lobby air. The officers turned Jason around, guiding him toward the main glass doors. His head hung low, his shoulders shaking as he wept. The golden boy was taking the walk of shame in a pair of steel bracelets. Every single employee standing in the lobby had their smartphones raised high in the air. The receptionists from the front desk, the security guards stationed by the turnstiles, the facility's management staff holding their cleaning carts. Everyone was recording the spectacular downfall of the Thorne family. They captured Jason's pathetic, cowardly crying as the heavy steel cuffs dug into his wrists. They captured Barbara's unhinged, violent screaming as she desperately tried to claw her way past the armed officers. They captured Richard's absolute humiliating defeat as he struggled to control his feral wife. The people who had suffered under their cruel, arrogant management for years, the people who had been denied promotions, belittled in meetings and threatened with termination, were actively documenting the exact moment justice was finally served. The quiet, satisfied murmurs of the staff echoed through the large open space. It was a beautiful, spontaneous chorus of corporate retribution. Within an hour, dozens of different camera angles of this arrest would be uploaded to social media. The high-definition footage would spread across the globe like wildfire. It was the ultimate devastating sequel to the coffee-pouring video from the country club. The internet would watch the arrogant family who proudly treated others like trash being aggressively hauled out with the morning garbage. I did not stand on the lobby floor with the rest of the employees. I did not involve myself in the chaotic screaming mess below. Instead, I stood perfectly still on the glass-enclosed mezzanine balcony located on the second floor, looking directly down at the spectacular ruin of the family that had abandoned me 16 years ago. My hands were resting lightly on the cool metal railing. My posture was tall, relaxed, and completely confident. I wore my tailored black turtleneck, the same simple, unbranded style they had mocked just yesterday at the brunch. The contrast between my serene, elevated position and their catastrophic meltdown on the ground floor was absolute poetry. From my elevated vantage point, I watched the police officers march my weeping brother through the sliding glass doors and out into the bright morning sunlight toward the waiting patrol car. I watched my mother collapse onto the polished marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably as my father tried to pull her up by her arm, his face pale and drained of all authority. I watched my sister staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization of her newfound poverty and the immediate loss of her elite status. I felt absolutely no remorse as I looked down at them. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering, complicated emotional attachment to the people crying on the lobby floor. They were not my family. They had never truly been my family. They were simply a toxic, malignant infection that I had successfully diagnosed, isolated, and permanently excised from my life. The 16 years of silence, the grueling late night shifts, the relentless drive to build my holding company, it had all culminated in this single perfect moment of absolute clarity. As the police cruiser lights flashed brightly through the tall lobby windows, casting harsh blue and red reflections across the marble, Richard suddenly looked up. His desperate, defeated eyes scanned the mezzanine balcony until they finally locked onto mine. He looked at me, hoping to find a shred of mercy, a hint of daughterly compassion, or a sign that I might eventually intervene to save them from their self-inflicted destruction. He wanted the scared little girl back. I looked down at him with absolute cold detachment. I did not smile, I did not sneer. I simply offered him a slow, deliberate nod of absolute finality. The message was perfectly clear. They had poured scalding coffee on my legs and demanded that I know my place. I had just shown them exactly where their place was. I had won the war, and I had left no survivors on the battlefield. I turned my back on the lobby, walking away from the glass railing and heading back toward the executive elevators to resume my duties as the chief executive officer. I stepped into the executive elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse suite. By the time I reached my office and sat down at my desk, the second video had already hit the internet. The footage of Jason crying in steel handcuffs spread faster than a raging wildfire. It was the ultimate sequel to the country club incident. The internet had spent the last 48 hours demanding justice for the woman who was assaulted with scalding coffee. Now they were watching that exact same arrogant family being completely destroyed on a massive corporate stage. The employees of Vanguard Logistics had uploaded dozens of different angles. You could see Jason throwing his pathetic tantrum and shattering the lobby display. You could see the exact moment his arrogant bravado completely evaporated when the police officers announced his federal wire fraud charges. And you could clearly see Barbara acting like a deranged maniac as she tried to physically fight an armed officer to save her criminal son. The comment sections across every major social media platform erupted in absolute celebration. People were relentlessly mocking Jason for crying like a terrified child. They were analyzing every second of my mother losing her mind in her expensive yellow dress. Financial news networks immediately picked up the story. They broadcasted the details of the Apex Holdings hostile takeover alongside the footage of the arrest. The narrative was absolutely flawless. The untouchable corporate executives who thought they could treat people like garbage had been ruthlessly ousted and indicted by the very person they had publicly humiliated. I watched the view counts climb into the tens of millions. My corporate public relations team issued a brief, sterile statement confirming that Vanguard Logistics had terminated several executives for severe financial misconduct and that the company was fully cooperating with local and federal authorities. We did not need to say anything else. The brutal visual evidence of their spectacular downfall did all the talking for us. The family that had built their entire identity on projecting absolute superiority was now the laughingstock of the entire country. Their toxic legacy was permanently cemented as a cautionary tale of corporate greed and massive public humiliation. The devastating consequences of their public exposure extended far beyond the digital world. The real-world fallout hit Barbara with a brutal and unforgiving speed. For decades, my mother had ruled the local suburban social scene with an iron fist. She had built her entire self-worth on her highly coveted status at the Oak Brook Country Club. She truly believed her wealthy friends were loyal to her. She was entirely wrong. The moment the evening news aired, the footage of Jason being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, the elite social circle violently slammed its doors shut. Barbara tried to attend her regular Tuesday morning charity committee meeting, simply pretending that nothing was wrong. She walked into the clubhouse dining room expecting her friends to offer her sympathy and support. Instead, she was met with absolute dead silence. Women she had known for 20 years completely ignored her presence. They turned their heads and actively looked away when she approached their tables. The country club management formally asked her to leave the premises, citing a strict policy against members who bring negative media attention to their prestigious establishment. She was escorted out of the building by a polite but firm manager, while her former friends watched in cold judgment. The social exile was immediate and permanent. Richard faced a similar, complete destruction of his reputation. His former business associates immediately blocked his phone number. Nobody wanted to be associated with an executive who had just been publicly fired for facilitating a massive embezzlement scheme. The wealthy suburban community they had always considered their personal kingdom entirely rejected them overnight. They became absolute pariahs. They could not even walk into their local luxury grocery store without people pointing and whispering about the viral videos. The pristine facade of the perfect wealthy family was completely gone. In its place was a deeply pathetic reality of exposed criminals and disgraced socialites. They had absolutely nowhere to hide from the overwhelming public shame they had brought upon themselves. The social humiliation was only the beginning of their absolute ruin. The financial devastation hit them with the crushing force of a tidal wave. Jason was sitting in a federal holding cell, and his bail was set at an astronomical amount due to the severe flight risk associated with offshore accounts. Richard and Barbara had to hire a highly expensive team of criminal defense attorneys just to keep their golden boy from being transferred to a maximum security facility before his trial. But they no longer had access to Richard and his massive corporate salary. They no longer had the stolen trust fund money. And Amanda was completely bankrupt from the massive salary clawback invoice I had legally enforced. The family was hemorrhaging cash at an entirely unsustainable rate. Within 3 weeks, the massive property taxes on their suburban estate came due. They simply did not have the liquid capital to cover the enormous bill. Richard was forced to put the sprawling mansion up for an urgent emergency sale. The house they had always used to project their massive wealth was suddenly listed at a steeply discounted price just to attract a quick cash buyer. I drove past the property one afternoon in my chauffeured town car just to see it for myself. A large wooden for sale sign stood proudly on the manicured front lawn. Moving trucks were already parked in the long, circular driveway. Movers were carrying out the expensive antique furniture and the custom artwork my mother had always prized above her own children. They were aggressively downsizing to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a much less desirable neighborhood. The new apartment was a dingy, poorly maintained unit above a loud commercial laundry facility. They could no longer afford the gourmet catered meals they were accustomed to eating every night. They had to sell their leased luxury vehicles and auction off Barbara and her expensive jewelry collection just to keep the aggressive defense lawyers on retainer. The massive suburban empire they had built over 3 decades had completely collapsed into a pathetic pile of moving boxes and mounting legal debts. As the reality of their absolute destitution finally settled over them, Barbara completely broke down. The woman who had proudly poured scalding coffee into my lap was now drowning in a terrifying ocean of poverty and profound social disgrace. She could no longer rely on Richard to fix her problems because Richard was entirely broken. He spent his days sitting in their cramped new apartment staring blankly at the wall as the reality of his ruined legacy slowly consumed him. Amanda was equally useless, having completely broken down after being forced to accept a minimum wage job at a local shopping mall just to pay her basic living expenses. Barbara was completely out of options and entirely desperate. She had absolutely no one left to manipulate. That is when my computer chimed with an incoming email notification. I was sitting in my penthouse office overlooking the beautiful city skyline when I saw her name pop up on my screen. It was a long, rambling message from Barbara. The subject line simply read, "Please read this. Diana, I am begging you." I clicked on the message and read the pathetic block of text. Barbara completely blamed Richard for everything that had happened. She claimed she had no idea about the embezzlement or the stolen college fund. She said Richard had forced her to pour the coffee on me at the country club to maintain his authority. It was a completely delusional rewriting of history. She ended the email by begging me for a small personal loan. She said the bank was coming to repossess her luxury sport utility vehicle the very next morning. She pleaded with me to send her just $10,000 to save her car, claiming she could not bear the absolute humiliation of riding the public bus. She mentioned how she still loved me and how Jason was struggling in jail because they could not afford his basic commissary money. She promised to pay me back with interest as soon as Richard found a new job, entirely ignoring the fact that his career was permanently dead. The sheer audacity of her demanding money from the very daughter she had literally thrown out onto the street was absolutely mind-boggling. She wrote paragraph after paragraph, detailing her own immense suffering, never once offering a genuine apology for the coffee incident or the 16 years of neglect. She still believed I was obligated to rescue her from the consequences of her own terrible actions. Her total lack of basic self-awareness remained truly staggering, and it was just completely and entirely pathetic to witness. I sat at the massive oak desk in my penthouse office overlooking the breathtaking Chicago skyline. The city lights glittered below me, a sprawling reflection of the empire I had built from absolute nothingness. My computer monitor chimed with a soft notification. An email had just arrived in my private corporate inbox. The sender name made a cold, familiar knot form in my stomach, but I no longer felt the childhood panic it used to bring. It was Barbara. The subject line read, "Please read this, Diana, I am begging you." I clicked the message open and leaned back in my leather chair. The email was a masterpiece of toxic narcissistic delusion. Barbara spent the first 4 paragraphs completely blaming Richard for the entire embezzlement scheme. She aggressively claimed she was just a helpless, obedient wife who had absolutely no idea that her luxury lifestyle was funded by corporate fraud and stolen college funds. She boldly stated that Richard had forced her to pour the scalding coffee on me at the country club brunch because he demanded she establish dominance. It was a staggering, pathetic rewriting of history. She completely erased her own malicious agency, portraying herself as the ultimate victim of the men in her life. Then came the true purpose of the message. The final paragraph was a desperate, groveling plea for cash. Barbara begged me to wire her $10,000 immediately. She claimed the bank was coming to repossess her luxury sport utility vehicle the very next morning. She wrote that she simply could not bear the absolute crushing humiliation of riding the public bus like a commoner. She promised to pay me back with interest the second Richard secured a new executive position, completely ignoring the fact that his career was permanently, irreparably dead. I stared at the blinking cursor. 16 years ago, an email like this would have sent me into an emotional tailspin. Now it was just pathetic. I did not type out an angry reply. I did not try to justify my actions or argue with her deeply twisted reality. I simply moved my mouse and clicked delete. The email vanished into the digital trash bin, reinforcing the absolute, impenetrable boundary I had built around my life. While I sat comfortably in my penthouse, Amanda was experiencing a very different kind of reality down on the ground floor of the working-class world. My 30-year-old sister was currently sitting in a cramped, poorly lit back office of a mid-tier retail clothing store at a local suburban shopping mall. She was wearing one of her remaining designer dresses, clutching her expensive handbag, as if it could somehow protect her from the profound indignity of her situation. Sitting across from her was a 22-year-old store manager wearing a cheap polyester uniform and a deeply confused expression. The manager was staring down at the resume Amanda had brought to the interview. The single sheet of paper was completely absurd. Under work experience, Amanda had boldly listed herself as the vice president of communications at Vanguard Logistics for 3 years. She had completely fabricated bullet points about managing global public relations strategies, directing elite client acquisitions, and overseeing massive corporate networking events. The young store manager looked from the resume to Amanda, clearly trying to understand why a highly paid corporate vice president was applying for a minimum wage part-time cashier position at a dying retail chain. Amanda forced a tight, incredibly unnatural smile. She tried to deploy the country club charm that usually opened doors for her, but the magic was entirely gone. The manager politely asked for a professional reference from Vanguard Logistics to verify her executive employment history. Amanda completely froze. She knew that any call to the corporate human resources department would immediately reveal that she had been terminated for gross payroll fraud and theft of corporate assets. She stuttered, claiming she had signed a strict non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from providing references. The young manager was not an idiot. She slid the resume back across the cheap folding table and flatly told Amanda that she was completely overqualified and entirely unsuitable for the position. Amanda was forced to stand up, grab her designer bag, and walk out of the store into the crowded mall, realizing with absolute horror that her completely fake, toxic work history had rendered her entirely unemployable. Miles away from the bustling shopping mall, Richard was facing his own permanent exile. The man who had spent 3 decades terrifying his subordinates and ruling his family with an iron fist was currently sitting alone in the tiny kitchen of a deeply depressing 2-bedroom apartment. The unit was located directly above a massive commercial laundromat. The constant rhythmic thumping of industrial washing machines vibrated through the cheap linoleum floor beneath his feet. The air smelled permanently of harsh bleach and stale dampness. It was a catastrophic downgrade from the sprawling manicured estate he had been forced to sell at a massive financial loss just to pay his aggressive criminal defense attorneys. Richard sat at a wobbly second-hand table, staring blankly at the dark screen of his smartphone. For the past 2 weeks, he had relentlessly called every single corporate contact, golf buddy, and industry associate he had accumulated over his entire career. He had left dozens of desperate voicemails begging for consulting work, contract jobs, or even entry-level management positions. Not a single person had returned his calls. The corporate world had completely blacklisted him. The news of his public termination and his documented involvement in Jason's massive federal embezzlement scheme had spread through the industry like a highly contagious virus. Nobody wanted a known fraudster anywhere near their operational budgets. He slowly set the phone down on the table, the harsh reality of his situation finally crushing the last remaining fragments of his massive ego. He had absolutely no savings left. His golden parachute was gone. His stock options were voided. His pension was completely frozen by federal investigators. At 60 years old, Richard was permanently barred from the only industry he knew. He was a disgraced, unemployable pariah listening to the relentless pounding of the washing machines below him, completely isolated in the miserable prison of his own making. Back in my pristine office, my focus returned to the present moment as my desktop computer issued another soft notification. I opened my primary inbox and found a highly exclusive, automatically generated email waiting for me. It was a formal administrative notification from the executive board of the Oak Brook Country Club. As the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, I had recently acquired a platinum corporate membership to the elite establishment. The email was a standard weekly update regarding club operations and membership statuses. I scrolled down the polished digital newsletter until my eyes locked onto the public disciplinary section. There, printed in clear, bold text, for every single elite member in Chicago to see was a formal notice of expulsion. The board of directors announced that the Thorne family memberships had been permanently revoked due to extreme non-payment of dues and severe violations of the club morality clause. The public disgrace was completely finalized. They had lost their home, their jobs, their freedom, and now they had officially lost the only social circle they had ever cared about. They were permanently locked out of the elite world. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the massive window at the golden afternoon sun hitting the Chicago skyline. A deep, profound sense of closure washed over me. I reached out and picked up my desk phone, pressing the direct line to my executive assistant. She answered on the first ring with perfect professionalism. I instructed her to call the Oak Brook Country Club immediately. I told her I needed to make a very specific reservation for this coming Sunday. I explicitly requested the large, premier table situated directly by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole on the main golf course. It was the exact same table where my mother had poured the scalding coffee on my legs just a few short weeks ago. I was returning to the scene of my ultimate public humiliation, not as a broken victim, but as an absolute conqueror, permanently claiming her rightful territory. The elite society they worshipped now belonged entirely to me. The ultimate corporate victory was fully secured, and a perfectly serene Sunday brunch was finally waiting for me. Sunday morning arrived with a brilliant cloudless blue sky that reflected perfectly off the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. My private driver navigated the sleek black town car through the winding tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburbs, pulling smoothly up to the grand entrance of the Oak Brook Country Club. I stepped out of the vehicle, and the crisp morning air felt entirely different this time. A few weeks ago, I had arrived at this exact location, bracing myself for a miserable encounter with the toxic ghosts of my past. Today, I was arriving to celebrate the magnificent, undisputed reality of my present. I was not wearing simple, unbranded dark clothing to blend into the background. I wore a stunning, flawlessly tailored ivory silk pantsuit that radiated absolute power and effortless sophistication. I paired it with a single tasteful diamond necklace that caught the bright morning sunlight. I looked exactly like what I was, the highly successful, utterly untouchable chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. The uniformed valet immediately rushed forward to greet me, his eyes wide with recognition and profound respect. The staff at the club definitely watched the viral videos. They knew exactly who I was and what I had done to the family that used to terrorize their service workers. I offered the valet a warm, genuine smile and walked through the heavy oak double doors into the grand lobby. The atmosphere inside the dining room was completely electric. As I walked across the plush carpets, the quiet hum of polite conversation visibly altered. Wealthy patrons, local politicians, and elite business owners paused their meals to look in my direction. There were no mocking whispers or condescending stares. Instead, I saw a wave of profound respect, quiet awe, and a healthy dose of corporate fear. These people had spent decades indulging Barbara and Richard, enabling their arrogant delusions of superiority. Now they were staring at the woman who had single-handedly dismantled that fake suburban empire in a matter of hours. I walked right past the tables of Chicago high society, with my head held high, completely unbothered by their intense scrutiny. The maitre d' hurried over, bowing slightly as he escorted me directly to the premier table by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole. It was the precise location where my mother had poured the carafe of scalding coffee into my lap. The table was impeccably set with crystal glassware and fresh white orchids. I took the seat facing the sprawling green golf course, breathing in the rich aroma of roasted espresso and fresh pastries. There was no anxiety tightening my chest. There was no looming threat of humiliation. The table was completely mine. Within 10 minutes, the rest of my party began to arrive. I was not hosting a miserable gathering of bitter, resentful blood relatives. I was surrounded by my chosen family. My chief corporate counsel arrived first, trading his usual severe courtroom suit for a relaxed navy blazer. He was followed by my two lead forensic accountants, the brilliant minds who had meticulously tracked Jason and his fake vendor shell company. Finally, my chief operating officer and closest confidant joined us, a fierce, brilliant woman who had stood by my side during the grueling early days of building Apex Holdings from a tiny startup into a corporate juggernaut. These were the people who actually mattered, They had not supported me out of some toxic conditional familial obligation. They had supported me because they respected my vision, my work ethic, and my integrity. We had weathered massive corporate storms together. We had worked 70-hour weeks side by side to secure our futures. They knew the real me, not the pathetic scapegoat narrative my parents had desperately tried to sell to the world. The waiter approached our table with a respectful, eager smile. I instantly recognized him. It was the exact same young man who had been assigned to my family table during that disastrous brunch weeks ago. He had been the one forced to watch Barbara physically assault me. He looked at me now with a bright, genuine warmth, clearly thrilled to be serving a table devoid of my arrogant father snapping his fingers or my spoiled sister making impossible demands. "Welcome back to the club, Miss Thorne," the waiter said, his voice carrying a tone of deep, unspoken solidarity. "It is an absolute pleasure to have you dining with us today. What can I bring for the table?" I ordered a round of premium dark roast coffees and the finest champagne the club had in its cellar. When the drinks arrived, my chief operating officer raised her crystal flute high into the air. The morning sunlight caught the bubbling golden liquid, casting bright reflections across the white linen tablecloth. To Diana, she announced, her voice ringing with deep pride and genuine affection. A brilliant leader, a fierce friend, and the absolute smartest chief executive in this city. We just closed the financial books on Friday afternoon. Thanks to the Vanguard Logistics acquisition and the immediate elimination of several massive fraudulent operational redundancies, Apex Holdings has officially finalized a record-breaking fiscal quarter. Our stock prices are soaring, our profit margins have doubled, and the market is absolutely terrified of what we might do next. We clinked our glasses together in a joyful, resonant toast. The crisp, expensive champagne tasted like absolute victory. As I took a slow sip of the perfect steaming premium coffee, I looked around the large circular table at the smiling faces of my trusted colleagues. I listened to their easy laughter and their brilliant, engaging conversation. We discussed global market trends, upcoming charity initiatives, and our aggressive expansion strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. There was no toxic competition. There was no petty belittling or desperate grasping for a patriarch's approval. There was only mutual respect, shared ambition, and genuine camaraderie. I realized in that beautiful sunlit moment that I had finally achieved the ultimate revenge. My victory was not just about exposing Richard and his fraudulent executive tenure. It was not just about sending Jason to a federal holding cell or forcing Amanda into total instant bankruptcy. It was not even about revoking Barbara and her highly coveted country club membership and watching her pathetic social standing completely disintegrate into dust. Those were simply the necessary, satisfying consequences of their own malicious actions. My true absolute revenge was sitting right here at this table. It was the undeniable concrete proof that I never actually needed them. For my entire childhood, they had aggressively conditioned me to believe that I was fundamentally broken. They had relentlessly pounded the idea into my head that without their money, their social status, and their elite family name, I would be a complete and utter failure. They threw me out into the cold, harsh world, when I was just a teenager, fully expecting me to eventually come crawling back to their doorstep, begging for forgiveness and a tiny scrap of their conditional love. Instead, I took the massive, gaping void they left in my life, and I filled it with unyielding determination. I channeled every single ounce of their rejection into building an extraordinary, untouchable reality. I became a highly educated, self-made titan of industry. I amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed the stolen college fund they used to buy Jason a sports car. I cultivated a brilliant, loyal circle of friends who protected me and elevated my potential. I had completely outgrown the small, petty, miserable world they occupied. I was entirely free. We spent 2 glorious hours enjoying the lavish brunch. We ate perfectly prepared food, shared wonderful stories, and celebrated the massive, hard-earned success of our corporate endeavors. Nobody screamed. Nobody threw a tantrum. Nobody poured a beverage on anyone else to prove a pathetic point about power dynamics. It was simply a perfect, peaceful Sunday morning. When the meal was finally over and the check was discreetly placed on the table, I smoothly reached into my ivory designer handbag. I did not pull out a corporate credit card. I reached for my sleek, unbranded leather wallet. I pulled out a neat stack of crisp $100 bills. The total cost of the meal was substantial, but I did not even look at the itemized receipt. I simply placed 10 $100 bills securely inside the leather folder. I looked up at the young waiter as he stepped forward to collect the payment. I slid the leather folder across the table toward him. I thought back to the single $100 bill I had left on this exact table weeks ago, intended to compensate him for cleaning up the dark, scalding mess my mother had intentionally created. "Keep the change," I said softly, offering him a warm, genuine smile. "Consider it a token of my deep appreciation for your excellent service today. And thank you for providing such a wonderful, peaceful atmosphere for my guests." The young man opened the folder, and his eyes went incredibly wide as he saw the massive $1,000 cash tip resting inside. He looked back up at me, absolutely beaming with profound gratitude. "Thank you so much, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "Please come back and visit us anytime. We would be honored to host you and your team again." I stood up from the table, smoothing the pristine fabric of my ivory silk suit. I gathered my belongings and turned to walk toward the main exit of the dining room alongside my brilliant colleagues. The other patrons respectfully parted to let us pass their eyes following our confident, unified departure. I did not look back at the table by the window. I did not need to check my phone to see if Barbara had sent another groveling, pathetic email begging for cash. I did not care what Richard was doing in his dingy, cramped apartment, or how Jason was handling the harsh reality of his impending federal trial. Their miserable, fraudulent lives were permanently trapped in my rearview mirror. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the country club lobby and stepped outside into the brilliant, warming afternoon sunlight. The crisp breeze caught my hair as my private driver immediately pulled the sleek black town car up to the curb. He stepped out and opened the rear passenger door for me with a bright, welcoming smile. I paused for a single second on the concrete walkway, tilting my face up to feel the direct, radiant heat of the sun against my skin. I took a deep, deeply satisfying breath of fresh air. My stride was completely unbroken, utterly confident, and perfectly secure. I slid into the quiet, luxurious comfort of my vehicle, ready to conquer the next massive corporate acquisition, completely and entirely unbothered by the ashes I had left behind.